chapter 10 now, and in chapter 10 we're going to talk about John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is one of the most famous economists in history, and he is especially important in macroeconomics. That's really where most of his acclaim comes from. He developed one of the primary economic belief systems. So there's classical economics, and then oftentimes what runs contrary to that today we'd call Keynesian economics. So a lot of what you're going to see in this chapter comes directly from the things that he believed in his writings and his teachings. It's really hard to talk about macroeconomics without talking about John Maynard Keynes. And even today he gets brought up from time to time in presidential debates on the news and things like that when they're talking about often presidential candidates' economic beliefs. So John Maynard Keynes, just to give you a bit of an information about him, he was British, and his lifespan is really, I think, very telling. He was born in 1883 and he died in 1946. And I think that John Maynard Keynes was really lucky in terms of the time he was alive, because if you recall back from chapter 9, classical economics really was challenged by the Great Depression. So what was happening here is during this period is the Great Depression wasn't fixing itself, right? You know, we showed in the last chapter why the economies may fix themselves if they're in a recessionary gap. And the Great Depression was a massive recessionary gap where the unemployment rate reached 25%. So, you know, most of the economy, or 20% roughly of the labor force is cyclically unemployed. It wasn't fixing itself, and so people began looking for other potential answers, and John Maynard Keynes was right in his wheelhouse in terms of his age, and his notoriety was starting to grow when the Great Depression occurred. So a lot of people jumped right into his beliefs, and it became the primary economic belief system around that period, and probably still is today. Among politicians, it certainly seems like most really believe in Keynesian economics. Among economists, it's still, I would say, split fairly evenly between classical and Keynesian economics, with the vast majority of economists believing there's merit to both, and you have to pick and choose what information is most important and is relevant in any given economic scenario. In other words, there's not one that's just right. They each can be right in different circumstances, and so you have to have a lot of knowledge to understand when to apply Keynesian or classical economics. Just some main ideas here. Didn't trust the assumptions of classical economics. And so that's what we're going to actually be doing in this first video, is going through those classical economic assumptions and questioning them. Didn't think necessarily that the classicals were always wrong, but rather they could be wrong sometimes. And it seems to me, and I'm taking this into my own perspective, but it seems to me that Keynes viewed classical economists as sometimes being potentially wrong, but the times that they were wrong being really, really bad times. So, for example, in the 19-teens or in the 2000 teens, like we're in right now, classical economics does fine, meaning government doesn't have to get involved, economy tends to fix itself. However, when times are really bad, like the Great Depression, classical economics seems to fail. And so it's the times when it fails when the macro economy is so important to us. And so he's really worried about could we really just let the economy just go, just say, okay, economy, fix yourself when things are really bad. He's saying maybe we shouldn't, especially when things are really, really bad, okay? So he didn't think the classicals were always wrong. They just could be wrong in certain scenarios. And ultimately, he viewed the economy as unstable. largely because he didn't trust the assumptions. Okay, so the economy was unstable, hence the title of this chapter here, Keynesian Macroeconomics and Economic Instability. And as a result, the government may need to get involved. And to be clear, when I say the government may be involved, both classical and Keynesian economists, of course, think we need a government, but classical economists say, the government needs to be doing things like, the police and having firemen and maybe setting up national parks and things like that, but staying out of the macroeconomy. Keynes would actually say that the government should get involved in the economy to try to stimulate it when things are bad. And so that's the big takeaway to take from this, right? If we're thinking about actual action, Keynes would recommend action if the economy is really bad. This is an important question because when the economy is really bad, people suffer. And so we're trying to figure out a way to make people suffer less. And just one last point to make here, just to try to give you an introduction. Demand is the key variable for Keynes. Aggregate demand, which is certainly very different from what you saw in classical economics where they spent so much time talking about supply. Okay, so what we're going to do first is tackle this one, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do in the rest of the videos, but point number one here is what I really want to address in this first video. So if you recall, there are 4 classical economic assumptions that we discussed in Chapter 9. And we're going to figure out criticisms for each of these. Criticisms of the classical model. So we're just going to run through each of these assumptions and say why they may be wrong. And again, for Keynes, he's not saying they're always wrong. He's just saying they may be wrong in certain circumstances. And so if they're sometimes wrong, then that means classical economics will sometimes fail. So let me give you an example of this right off the bat. Prices are flexible. This is important because prices need to be flexible for prices to reach equilibrium and markets to reach equilibrium. Okay? Keynes is not so sure that this is going to occur. Why this could fail? Well, we can probably give a whole list of reasons why prices might not be flexible, but let me give you a couple. Prices may be based on marketing. For example, something I often think about in regards to prices being inflexible is the junior bacon cheeseburger at Wendy's. When I was growing up all the way through college even, the junior bacon cheeseburger was 99 cents. It didn't change at all. What that suggests is the prices for junior bacon cheeseburgers were not flexible, right? If prices were truly flexible, they'd be changing a lot, very often, in response to things like changes in demand, in response to changes of cost. So if meat becomes more expensive, you would expect the price of the junior bacon cheeseburger to probably go up too. But it didn't. And the reason is because the 99 cents was a marketing tool. They liked the fact that they could market for that 99 cents. It got people into the store, into Wendy's, and they would purchase other things in addition to the junior bacon cheeseburgers. So marketing might be a reason why prices don't change easily, okay? And if this is happening, then markets may not reach equilibrium. They may become unpredictable. They may become unstable. Another more complex idea is something called menu cost. Menu cost, that's a new term for us. And it's defined as such here. Menu costs is the cost associated with changing prices. Meaning just changing prices alone is costly. And it's costly for any business, okay? So for example, if you go to a coffee shop, a lot of times coffee shops like Blackbird here in Milledgeville will just have a big chalkboard, okay, and they'll have their prices written up there. If they want to change the prices of their coffees, it will have to incur a small cost. The cost will be that some employee is going to have to go up there and erase and then use some chalk and write up the new price. Okay, so it's going to use a little bit of labor, it's going to use a little bit of chalk, and it's going to wear out the chalkboard just a little bit. Frankly, very small menu costs, right? That's probably not going to cause them to avoid making price changes. But for other businesses, changing prices can be a really big deal. Think about a company like LL Bean or East Bay, if you're familiar with one of those companies. These are companies that send out catalogs maybe 3 or 4 times a year. So imagine if they wanted to change the price after they've already sent out a catalog, right? So they send out a catalog and they say, you know, Air Force Ones are going to be $200 in the catalog. The next day they realize it should have been $195. They're not going to send out a new catalog with that price change to everyone that they send it to. It would just be so costly. So for a company like this that deals with a lot of mailing and a lot of production of physical catalogs, menu costs end up being really high. Okay? So menu costs are a reason why businesses may choose to avoid changing prices. They may realize that the price of something should go up a few cents, but they may say the benefit of raising that price a few cents is not worth the cost of changing the menus. Okay? So again, that might make prices inflexible. And if prices are inflexible, then that can lead to some strange problems, such as, for example, the price being stuck here, leading to, in this case, a shortage, leading to this market not reaching equilibrium. And if enough markets aren't reaching equilibrium, the economy can, again, just be very unstable and unpredictable. Okay? So that's one reason why prices, or 2 reasons actually why prices might not be flexible. You may be able to come up with some other ones on your own. One that I really like to think about, and this is how Keynes felt, maybe people are just stupid and they don't know what to do with changing prices. Maybe they're stupid, maybe they're lazy. Yeah, maybe they know they should raise prices, but they just don't because they're lazy. There's a lot of lazy workers out there, so that's a pretty compelling argument. Another assumption was that wages are flexible. And we're going to spend the most time on this one here. Wages are flexible. A few reasons why they may not be flexible. Contracts. Okay? And this is sort of a point that the classical economists and the Keynesian economists wouldn't disagree on. They both knew that contracts exist. This is more about opinion. Okay? Classical economists would say, look, there are contracts, but eventually prices will adjust. Wages will adjust. Okay? Keynes would say, contracts, yeah, they exist, and they may eventually adjust, but do we really want to wait? If we're going to fix a recessionary gap, if you remember back from Chapter 9, for recessionary gaps to fix themselves, one of the key elements of that is for wages to drop. Keynes's argument would be, well, let's not wait for wages to drop. Let's let the government get involved now. So he viewed this really as a problem. Classical economists just viewed it as a characteristic, not a big concern. So contracts might influence that. Minimum wage laws, that's what we're about to talk about here in a second, may lead to wages that aren't flexible. And then a third one, which is something I'm sure you haven't heard of before, is something called an efficiency wage. So that's a new term that we're going to have to define. Okay? So contracts, not a whole lot to talk about there, but let's talk about minimum wage. So let me draw up a market here. Actually, I'm going to just erase everything. We need plenty of room. And let's talk about minimum wage. So let's say this is low-skilled labor. Okay? I choose low-skilled labor because low-skilled labor is the labor that's most likely to be affected by minimum wage laws. Most people aren't affected by minimum wage laws. In fact, it's a very small percent of the labor force that is actually influenced by the minimum wage directly. Most people are paid a lot more than that. So here's the wage. Here's the quantity of labor. And let's say this is what the minimum wage looks like. Here's our labor supply. Here's our labor demanded. And let's say that the actual wage that occurs in this market is $8. Okay? So scenario 1, let's imagine that the wage at equilibrium is $8 and the minimum wage is $7. And I want you to think about what would happen in this scenario. Okay? If the actual wage at equilibrium is $8, what happens if the government comes in and says, you got to pay your workers at least $7? This is always funny to me because students, they tend to miss this. So I really hope you guys, you're watching the video right now. If you're hearing me, don't make this mistake on the quiz or exam. If the minimum wage is $7 and the equilibrium wage is $8, what are the businesses and what are the individuals going to do? Okay? They will ignore the minimum wage. The $8 wage is what would happen in a free market. And if the government comes in and says you got to pay your workers at least $7, the businesses and the workers are just going to ignore that. And if you don't believe that to be true, think about it a little bit more. There is a minimum wage right now of $7.25, and I'm paid more than that. And that minimum wage, my employer doesn't just suddenly pay me the minimum wage simply because it exists. The same thing here. Just because there is a $7 minimum wage, it's going to be meaningless, okay? It's like asking, like, how does a minimum wage affect LeBron James' salary? It doesn't, right? It doesn't have any bearing on it at all. The same thing here. If these workers are going to get paid $8 with no minimum wage law, then the minimum wage law of $7 is going to do nothing because they can still operate at $8, okay? This is called a non-binding minimum wage. A non-binding minimum wage. If something is non-binding, that means it exists, but it's not doing anything, okay? So this minimum wage has no effect on the market. At least not right now. Now it could in the future. Maybe if labor supply increased or labor demand decreased, maybe eventually that minimum wage could start making a difference. But for now, it's not doing anything. Okay. So in scenario 1, the minimum wage does nothing. That's one possibility. Well, what does the second possibility look like? Do you think? What could we do to make the minimum wage bind, meaning actually do something? For the minimum wage to actually do something, it would have to be above the equilibrium wage. Okay, so an equilibrium wage of 8 and a minimum wage of 10. Now this minimum wage is actually going to do something. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of redraw my graph here. Here's where we are with no minimum wage. We have an equilibrium. Let's say, I'm trying to deal with numbers because I think it makes it a little easier to understand. So let's say there's 500 as the equilibrium here. What does that 500 represent? It represents the number of hours, perhaps, that the workers want to work. And since it's an equilibrium, it also represents the number of hours the businesses want to hire. So it's an equilibrium because the businesses want to hire exactly as many workers as there are workers who want to work, because the wage is right at $8, which is the equilibrium. So what's going to happen here with a minimum wage of 10 is that first thing to recognize is this is going to be binding, okay? So this is going to be binding, meaning it makes a difference. And the reason it's going to be binding is that equilibrium wage is no longer an option. Okay? So what are the businesses going to do? What's going to happen in this market? Well, the market, in a free market, would operate at 8. And so what's going to happen is they're going to try to get as close to 8 as possible. And so what's going to end up happening is they operate right at $10, right at the minimum wage. Okay? The government says you got to pay your workers at least 10, and they're going to pay as little as they can because they'd rather be even lower than that. The result of this is the quantity of labor supplied goes up. maybe it's now 600. What that means is there are now more workers wanting to work, or there are more workers wanting to work more hours than before. Okay? So the amount of people wanting to work goes up. Meanwhile, the businesses actually want to hire fewer workers. So maybe it drops to 370 perhaps. So what we're left with here is a quantity of labor supplied of 600 and a quantity of labor demanded of 370. So how many people are actually going to find a job? 370 are going to find a job, all right? Let's go ahead and assume this is the number of workers, okay? The number of full-time workers businesses hire. They're going to hire 370. And so what we're left with here is 230 unemployed. And they're unemployed in the literal sense because they are wanting to work, applying for jobs, right? Supplying labor, but there's not any labor demand for them. So they're looking for a job, but they can't find one. So what this shows is the minimum wage actually creates some unemployment. All right? Now, is it good for the workers, the minimum wage, or bad? When you see this the first time, I've noticed students tend to make a mistake. They tend to look at this and say, well, the workers are worse off. Some are worse off. Some are better off, too. Specifically, 370 are better off. And they're better off because their wage went up. All right? So that's this group right in here. These people are better off. Now, how many people are worse off? This is actually a much more interesting question than when immediately you have to dive in to see exactly what's happening. You can't just look at this and say, okay, 230 are unemployed, so that's how many people are worse off. It's not exactly what's going on here. How many people are a lot worse off than before? It's only 130. This is the group right here that's truly worse off because there were 500 people employed when there was no minimum wage. Now with the minimum wage, there's only 370. So there's 130 people are worse off because they lost their job. And so what happens to this last group in here? What happens to this 100? This is an interesting group. There are 100 people that are now looking that weren't looking before. And it's actually interesting to think, are these people worse off or not? You could make an argument either way. You could say they're worse off because now they're looking for a job and wasting their time. Alternatively, you could say they're better off because now they're out there applying for jobs and eventually they'll find one. You know, they're putting together their resume and they're actually out there doing something. So maybe eventually this leads to them being more productive. It's hard to say, okay? Truth be told, some of these people would end up in here, meaning some of these people who weren't looking but now are would actually find a job. More of these people would end up down here. It would mix them all up essentially. But the end result, what we should take away from this is really simple. Some are better off, some are worse off, and some are kind of hard to tell. Okay, so minimum wage, is it a good or a bad thing? It depends. It depends on what you care about. It's a pretty tough subject really to give definitive answers on. Is it good or bad for businesses? Probably bad for the businesses that have a lot of low wage workers because it's raising their costs. Okay. Now, how does this matter in the Keynesian model? Right. Getting back to what we were talking about, wages are flexible. This is one of the assumptions. Wages must be flexible. Okay. What minimum wage does is it makes it impossible for wages to be flexible in the downward direction if the minimum wage is binding. That's a pretty complicated statement, but what I'm basically arguing here is, remember that for a recessionary gap to fix itself, one of the steps is that wages must drop. If you're having trouble follow that, go back to chapter 9 because that's really important that you understand that. Wages have to drop for the market to fix itself. However, if we're here, it can't drop, right? The minimum wage that's set by the government is going to make it impossible for wages to drop. So this is one reason why wages might not be flexible. Can't really blame the classical economists for not noticing this, because they didn't really have any minimum wages during their time period. And under Keynes, they really didn't either. But we know that today, in our modern economy, most developed countries have minimum wages, so this is a potential reason why they won't be flexible. All right, so we're still on the same topic that wages must be flexible. Now let's talk about efficiency wages. Okay, so I'm going to draw my my market up here again for the labor. This is our labor supply, our labor demand, and this is our wage. Wages must be flexible. So another reason why they might not be flexible is because of something called efficiency wages. These are wages that businesses pay that are intentionally set above the equilibrium wage. Okay? So basically, if we're thinking about our market over here, and maybe this is the market for, let me give you a good example here. Maybe this is the market for dog sitting, because I pay efficiency wages in dog sitting. And I'm in a college town, so there's a lot of available cheap labor when it comes to having somebody come over and look after my dog when I'm out of town. There could be an equilibrium quantity. There could be a wage that's offered. Maybe it's let's say the equilibrium wage is $20 a day, okay, and that's basically to come over and feed the dog in the morning and feed the dog in the evening. What this basically means is, if I want to hire a dog sitter, all right, how much am I going to have to pay them? $20, all right? $20 will land me somebody to come over and help me. Somebody come over and watch the dog. $20 will do it, because that's the equilibrium. But let's say that I really care about my dog, and I really want to make sure the person that comes in does a good job. What I might decide to do is actually pay more than that. There may be plenty of people out there willing to do a $20 a day, but what I do instead is I pay them a little bit more. So I offer a wage of $30. Okay? In efficiency wage scenarios, all of the businesses, or many of the businesses in the market, all decide to do this. Okay? So they choose to do this, maybe not by communicating about it, but they realize there's advantages. So what is that going to end up doing? Well, it's going to drive up the number of people who want to work, and it's going to reduce the number that we actually hire. Okay? It's kind of a strange thing, but the businesses are choosing to pay their workers more. This sounds almost like it would never happen if you think about workers like you would think about capital. So for example, let's say I need a new desk for my office, and they tell me it's $300 for a desk, and I say, all right, I want it, but I'm going to pay you $400, right? I'm going to intentionally pay you more than you demand. That wouldn't happen with capital, because a desk is a desk. It doesn't have emotions. It doesn't have feelings, right? But workers do. And if you pay them more than the equilibrium wage, maybe there's some benefits from that. So here are some reasons why you might do this. One is it may lead to more worker effort. Why would it lead to more worker effort? The simple kind of non-economic-y answer is, maybe if you pay somebody more, they just feel more appreciated, so they work harder. But another potential explanation is, if we're paying efficiency wages, that's actually going to create unemployment. In this market, this is the unemployment. I know they're unemployed because this is the amount of people wanting to work, and this is the number of workers they're actually hiring. So the people in here want a job but can't find one. So one reason why they might work harder is because they realize if they lose their job, they're going to join the ranks of this big group of unemployed workers. So they're basically going to work extra hard because they're scared of losing their job. So worker effort is one reason why they might do this. Another reason is job turnover. If I'm paying my workers more than this $20 level, they're going to stick around. The worker's probably going to stick around because there aren't many options out there because of all the unemployment, and also because they realize they're getting paid a high wage, right? These workers are willing to work for less than $30, and I'm paying them, or less than, they're willing to work for, at equilibrium, 20, and I'm offering them 30. So they know this is a good deal for them. So the reason why this is beneficial to me is this allows me to avoid training costs, okay? Paying a worker more might not necessarily make them a better worker, okay? Even if it doesn't change their worker effort. What it will do is it'll allow me to keep my workers around. And if I keep my workers around, I'll avoid having to pay to train new workers, right? Just to give you an example of this, when we hire a new professor here at Georgia College, there's a tremendous amount of work and a lot of money spent to do so. So we're gearing up to hire a new finance faculty member in the fall. And that means we've got to post an ad on this website. It's really expensive. It's like $1,000 to post the ad. Then we're going to have 3 or 4 people fly out to San Diego, spend 3 or 4 nights at a conference interviewing all these candidates, which is going to use up a lot of worker time, the people that are going out there. It's also going to involve a lot of costs in terms of paying for the flights and the hotels and registering for the conference. And then after that, we're going to fly 3 candidates in to come out and interview, which is going to use more worker time. More people like me are going to have to, go to these, conduct the interviews, go to their presentations, go out to dinner with them. We're going to do a lot, okay? So we're going to have to pay for these people to come out, pay for their airfare, pay for their hotel, take them out to lunch, take them out to dinner, use up our time going out, and introducing them to people around campus. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of money being spent. So what we might decide to do is pay our workers more now, not thinking necessarily it's going to cause them to be better workers, but to avoid those training costs in the future. This is basically spending a little extra money now to avoid those training costs in the future. Another reason why you might do this is to improve the pool of applicants. Simple as this. All right? At the wage of 20, I can hire someone, and they could be good or they could be bad. But if I'm paying 30, I'm going to get better people applying. Okay? Essentially, it's as simple as this. If I have my wage set at 20, I'll get a certain group to apply. And if I raise it to 30, I'll still get those people applying, but I'll get more people applying. And those extra people who apply are probably going to be good workers. And the reason why that is because if they're strong workers, they're not willing to work for 20. All right? The best workers are going to require more money. So if I set my salary high, I get better workers applying. Okay? So that might help me hire somebody who's more talented. And then a fourth reason that is not quite so important in the U.S., but is very important in developing lower income countries is worker health. In a lot of developing countries, the equilibrium wage will be really low, maybe 50 cents an hour or something like that. And if workers are getting paid 50 cents an hour, that might not be enough money to allow them to have a good diet so that they're healthy. They may have to work 2 or 3 jobs, which makes them less capable as workers. So I may decide to pay them more than that in order to make them healthy. So they come to work well rested, they're not getting sick all the time, they're ready to go. Okay? See this similarly in the U.S., if you increase my salary, maybe I don't have to get a second job, which just makes me a little bit better in my current job. Paying a little bit more can do a lot in terms of making me healthier. Maybe if I am paid more, I have more money to spend on, going to the gym. And if I go to the gym, maybe I'm just more productive, better physical condition, when I come to work. So all of these are reasons why businesses may choose to pay their workers more than they have to in order to hire a good worker. Why is this relevant in this idea of wages must be flexible? Well, the answer is pretty similar to what we saw with minimum wages. If businesses are offering efficiency wages, wages, again, may not be flexible, especially in the downward direction. So what I mean by that is, if they're paying their workers 30, these businesses, and they're able to generate a profit from that, and then the economy's in a recessionary gap, classical economists would say in a recessionary gap, wages should drop. But these businesses may decide to keep paying 30 because they realize there's benefits to paying that wage. You know, they've had these employees that have been skilled. There was this helped improve their pool of applicants. It made them healthier. It made the workers work harder. You might not want to undo all of that goodwill and all of that effort to drop the wages a bit. So the businesses may decide to keep their wages here. And if they do that, they may not adjust. Wages may not be flexible, and the whole classical model may fail. It's really important.